thank you, Jake, for that explication of what's really one of the I would say that chapter 3 that's as hard as it gets in this book. It's I would say it's his most densely technically philosophical part of the book, and he is, in certain ways, what he's doing there is I would say, if you remember in the preface, he said, well, those of you who are bored with 20th century philosophy, just skip part 1 and just go to the history. And those of you who those readers who aren't interested in history, if by some chance you, by mistake, you have this book in your hands, then just read part 1. Now, the funny thing is that there are a lot of philosophy departments who do very little history. And the historical viewpoint, in fact, the viewpoint that in some sense is central to this whole course, to our work in PCC, and to Taylor's book, is the essential quality of history and narrative. Because in many ways he's situating us in a larger narrative, and he's giving us a lot of clues to understand that narrative so that we understand our current moral world with greater clarity. So that's why I imagine he did say, well, some people might want to read part 1 but not the rest of the book, but I think the majority of readers starting with chapter 5 and part 2 through 5, the rest of the book, you'll notice that it just unfolds with a kind of, there's relatively little that I think won't be clear with just your adequate graduate school attention. But this one here, it's a kind of insider baseball kind of chapter, where he's taking on his fellow moral philosophers and taking one argument after another and wrestling it down to the ground so that he can clear space for us to see a bigger vision of our moral world. But there's the language is I think particularly perhaps in 3.1 is especially technical, where he's he's talking about prescriptive and descriptive, and they're being extensionally equivalent, or projectable properties, that he's using that word projectable in a way that's clearly different from how he's been talking about values are projected onto the neutral world. So wait a minute, what's going on there? The various horns of dilemmas that the philosophers are moderately impaled on, it can get a bit much. But the basic vision that Taylor's setting forth throughout chapter 3 is exactly identical to and continuous with chapters 1 and 2. And in fact, what he's basically doing is taking the picture that he is painting for us in chapters 1 and 2, and which I think all of us have a decent grasp of at this point. He is now applying that to the world of academic moral philosophy, because that's his world in many ways. And so even though he's reaching a much wider world of scholars and people who think thoughtfully about life with this book, he also wants to be heard by and to be persuasive to his peers within the philosophical profession. And you could say that what he's been doing since chapter 1, just in terms of that and it becomes particularly clear in this chapter 3, is that if we take that modern sense of the human subject in a world that we now provisionally give authority to natural science, modern natural science, as being able to explain somewhat powerfully through third-person explanatory procedures, in other words, neutralized, disenchanted. Even if we grant that, he's saying this is real. This is just as real to our best accounts of human life in this world, which includes humans, as the most convincing accounts that we now have of from quantum physics and relativity theory or evolutionary biology about what's going on in this world. And what he's particularly wrestling down to the ground, one philosophy after another, are the attempts to essentially neutralize the human subject. To just remove to take the explanatory principles by which the disenchanted natural world is understood by conventional mainstream modern science and apply those to the human subject. And he says, this is a boundary you can't cross. We may another time take on out here, but for right now, I want to show us, in a sense, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that all of us live according to and rely on the reality, the ontological, substantial character of our world of moral values. And in the course of, he's basically, he is stopping the reductionist naturalist project of colonizing the human subject, of colonizing the human subjectivity. And he's saying it's just not going to work. And in doing that, in chapter 3, he reaches, in chapter 1, showing moral frameworks and strongly valued distinctions and moral ontology, and in chapter 2, showing the reality of moral space and how absolutely inextricably connected our stance in moral space is with our identity, and that this also necessarily involves narrative, because we're placing ourselves in relationship to the good and in a larger frame of reference in which we have to decide, are we in contact with the good, and are we moving towards it or away from it, and so forth. Now in chapter 3, after kind of clearing aside the attacks from reductionist strategies within the field of moral philosophy, he then opens up the idea of hypergoods, which is a superbly useful tool, conceptual tool and insight, which will be able to illuminate many things, as he intimates. And in fact, one of the things I like about how he does that in this chapter, and that shows how he argues and how he takes the reader's intelligence seriously, is that when he gets to hypergoods, like on page 64, he says, I'll take up this issue of the status of the moral in the next section. Here I want to pursue further the nature of hypergoods and the difficulties they pose for the thesis I've been developing. He introduces the idea of hypergoods in part to take on the difficulties for his own theory. That shows how he's carrying the pole of doubt. Those of you who've done my art and discipline of writing or heard that talk or work with me in that area know how important I see that is to carry the pole of doubt in your writings. It's a way of basically getting outside the absolute validity of your own perspective and putting yourself in the position of another reader or of multiple other readers, other perspectives, and in a sense doing good writing and editing of your own writing and revising is a relational act. It's a moving into an I-thou just in the very act of skillful writing. And I think Taylor demonstrates that here with how he discusses hypergoods. I thought I might just take a moment right now to unpack a couple of terms that just might trip one up. I mentioned projectable, for example. Let's see, where did he use that? That was here we go, page 68. Now remember that up until this point, he has been combating the reductionist project or impulse to reduce our moral values and how we live by those strong distinctions as nothing more than the projection of either our sociobiological instincts, like we've just been kind of evolved. We've been selected by evolution to see things this way. For example, that would be the tack taken by sociobiology, and which is very widely regarded. It's widely accepted by, for example, evolutionary psychologists, or by, say, E.O. Wilson, he refers to a number of times in this book, and is a spokesperson for that point of view. But then he uses 68, about 3/4 of the way down, the end of that third paragraph, where he says, virtue terms like courage or generosity, he said, the logic of virtue terms like courage or generosity is such that they have to be construed as picking out projectable properties, just as red or square do, an essential feature of which is precisely their value. In other words, in our experience of moral values and of the good, an essential feature of it is that we see it as good and it's compelling on us. We feel awe before it. We feel admiration. We're drawn towards it. In depth psychological terms or religious studies terms, we'd say it's carrying a numinous aura. It draws our libido to it. We want to change our lives to live up to that standard, to that value. And but then he's calling these courage or generosity that they are projectable properties. And you might at first think, well, does that mean, does projectable essentially, it seems to be undercutting his argument if you think that it's projecting in an illusory way your inner what you think is true and projecting it onto the world as if it's real, but it's just a projection. But he doesn't mean it that way, and he's using it in a technical way in which projectable properties are qualities that can be like coherently projected forward from a set of current cases to future ones, so that you can, if you are able to recognize a quality in a set of situations or particulars, those qualities will be projectable if you can know how to go on from there to recognize others, which wouldn't be possible if they're just projections, which is why it's a peculiar word to use there. There's another word, or at least it's a potentially confusing word. Another word was like deontological, which Jake used last week as well, briefly. And I thought, it could be so easy for people to think, well, deontological, it's like hyphen ontological. Is this like against ontology? Is it not ontological? Or something like that. That's not, the root is different. It's, the word would be broken at right after deont, D-E-O-N, which refers to duty or what, and so deontology is the study of, the science of, what is our duty. Okay, and so it has a particular meaning. That also transcendental. He uses the word transcendental in the same paragraph in two completely different senses. If you just jump to page 39, if you remember that, this is last chapter, where in the middle of it, he said, a close cousin to Romanticism is the self of the American transcendentalists, in a sense containing the universe, but bypassing, is the self of the American transcendentalists, in a sense containing the universe, but bypassing any necessary relation to other humans. That sense that we're all... Transcendentalism is that part of the Romantic movement coming out of Europe that it had a very strong sense of nature as a spiritual source that you could tap right into and not necessarily deal with other human beings. It was just on its own, just hang out in the Lake District with your poetic sensibility, and you'll be in touch with it. Anyway, but then he says, but these grandiose aspirations do nothing to lift the transcendental conditions. Okay, now he's using the word transcendental in a Kantian sense. So sometimes, and which Jake was just talking about, transcendent, like basically these would be the conditions of possibility for something to occur. They transcend our individual subjectivity, but they're not necessarily in this transcendent dimension of heaven or the Platonic archetypal realm or something like that. They just transcend our individual subjectivity, but they are, for example, Jung would always speak about who really took in Kant very strongly. It says 6 o'clock, that must be wrong. It's like, wow, that went fast. Yeah. When you get older, time goes. Yeah, right, exactly. Let's see, I was just talking about...
Transcendental.
Yeah, that Jung, who really absorbed Kant, thank you, and he basically wanted to just say that the archetypes were prior to our individual subjectivity, and they, in that sense, transcended our individual subjectivity and were rooted in a collective unconscious, a collective psyche, which eventually he started leaking out into the anima mundi itself, into the world's soul. But initially it was the collective human psyche, collective human unconscious, and that was so the archetypes were part of the transcendental conditions of our subjectivity, but they weren't. He wasn't. He was trying to avoid a transcendent philosophical, what he would call a metaphysical position of saying, well, these archetypes are in the Platonic heaven, for example, as Plato would have said right away. So those are just a few little word clarifications. Also, that word pathological, which came up, it was a very good question at the end of last. I think you brought it up, right? Yeah, and and you were wondering whether. Let's look at that sentence. This is the very end of. Yes, here we go. No argument can take someone from a neutral stance towards the world, either adopted from the demands of science or fallen into as a consequence of pathology, to insight into moral ontology. Let's see, just before that, I think it was maybe the preceding paragraph.
Page 32, just before 2.2.
Oh, that's what it was, thank you. I remembered it was at the end of this first section of the chapter, but not that one. Okay. But what description of human possibilities drawn from some questionable epistemological theories ought to trump what we can describe from within our practice itself as the ultimate, as the limits of our possible ways of making sense of our lives? Did I just go past it?
Right after that.
After all, the ultimate basis for accepting any of these theories is precisely that they make better sense of us than do their rivals. Here it is. If any view takes us right across the boundary and defines as normal or possible a human life which we would find incomprehensible and pathological, it can't be right. It's on these grounds that I oppose the naturalistic thesis and say that the horizons in which we live must include strong qualitative discriminations. Okay, now I thought more about your very good point, like, well, wouldn't this be potentially vulnerable to a kind of moral criticism that he's speaking about a form of human being that might be considered abnormal, but that doesn't make it immoral in some more deep sense. But Taylor's not speaking of an observed abnormal way of life. He's not talking about like a socially anomalous, abnormal misfit person or form of life in which he could be criticized for adhering to a particular social construct of what's normal, which would be what R.D. Laing, for example, and many others criticized about psychiatric practice, Foucault as well. That normal is just a culture-bound, oppressive, or potentially oppressive, arbitrary standard. Taylor's not talking about that when he's talking about of a totally imaginary abstraction that was created by a particular philosophical ideology, naturalist reductionism, to explain how all human beings actually live. And he's just saying this abstraction, which we never see in real life, is just, that's why he calls it a monster. This is a monster in the technical sense of it's imaginary. It's completely unrealistic, and it's constructed just in order to be able to preserve a limited epistemology. That's the only reason it's constructed. It's not like an abnormal misfit person that we might someday run into. It's just not. It's an abstraction, and it's not at all a very convincing argument to say that this is the best way of explaining how all human beings live if you actually can't find one person who realistically could ever live that way. That's his point there. There's not a lot of places where I would criticize Taylor, but one little word that I thought was one of the very few times that he could have been a little more careful was when he was on page 65, where he is talking about origin points of the hypergoods, and he let's see, did I put this? Oh, here it is. So the hypergoods. By the way, this is ought. Here's the ought. Here's the is, right? The neutral void, third person explanation of the natural sciences. That's what is, and Hume is saying the ought is a totally different reality, and so the error theory that Jake was talking about of John Mackey is basically oughts you don't see anywhere else in the universe. This is probably just a weird human anomaly.
Fiction.
A fiction.
Yeah.
Let's come up with an explanation that allows us basically to just have somehow a kind of pointillistic, a punctual self that has no depth, and it has no moral space or moral ontology that it's living within. And Taylor is saying that's an impossibility. So that's the is ought. The fact and value distinction is the same thing. Here's the world of facts, here's the world of values inside that circle. Now, what Jake brought up is important about hypergoods is that they're all coming. Remember, I drew the axial as being this the higher world of the good or of God is experienced as being radically different from and superior to the empirical world, though human beings may be made in the image of God, or they may have access to the divine nous, to the divine mind. They can come outside of the cave and see things from the true archetypal light out there, but they're in the immanent empirical world. But Jake was bringing up the idea that there's something axial about them, because in the same way that this this is the Vogelin distinction that the compact cosmologies of, for example, the primal indigenous traditions, the tribal life, and the sacred and the social structures of the tribal life was embedded in a sacred context that pervaded the world of nature and the world of spirits and ancestors, and there wasn't a distinction. And even when you got to, I don't have enough room I'm not going to draw it in today, but those of you who've been in other classes know I've kind of drawn in like what the archaic worldview looks like. Running out of space. I mean, just briefly, the archaic, these are now out of order because basically it would go, maybe I'll just put it over here so you know it's in order of historical emergence. But the archaic had the kind of pyramid society of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Aztecs, etc. And they had the divine is penetrating, it's saturating into the world, but it's particularly getting located, instead of in the primal, it's more up in a transcendent dimension of the stars, the celestial world, the gods that are in the heavens, that the king or the pharaoh or the the most elevated members of that society have special access to. So those were compact cosmologies because you didn't have a place from within the cosmology to critique the social structure, because the social structure was sacred through and through. You lived in a mythic frame of reference in which there's no separation of church and state, briefly. And what the axial brings about is that separation, so that you can critique the empirical society, because you've got you've got leverage from a higher level of reality to be able to assess how the empirical world of our social relations and political power and so forth, how it's going, and to say these are two different realities. So those were Vogelin called those differentiated cosmologies, and they come in with the axial. And so then Taylor brings up when he's introducing hypergoods, he says that, this is page 65, about 2/5 of the way down, he says, to take two other crucial origin points of such goods, Platonism in one way and the Judeo-Christian religious revelations in another, both have been defined as historical supersessions. So he's pointing out how hypergoods emerge in such a way that they supersede previous goods in their previous hypergoods in their sovereignty. And so he describes those as historical supersessions of the Homeric-inspired honor ethic, on the one hand, that's by Platonism, and then a supersession by Judeo-Christian religious revelations, a supersession of various forms of idolatry, respectively. Well, idolatry is putting it in a form that already makes the case that those pagan polytheistic religions are just worshiping idols. And that is the way that the Judeo-Christian revelations would hold that, but it's not, it's just a moment where I thought he should have put quotation marks on idolatry, and then we'd know right away what he meant. He's talking about it from a particular perspective of hypergood supersession. Okay, I think what I'll do, knowing that we've got, I really want to open up to our questions and discussion here. A couple of funny notes on following up on Jake. He was bringing up how the third person description that's used for all of our behavior that Taylor is combating, and Jake was giving some examples of that effort. And of course, behaviorism in the 20th century was the paradigm version of third-person explanation. And Stan Grof, behaviorism, of course, is a type of psychology, and Stan, a depth psychologist, like to tell the joke about two behaviorists who are committed to just all external third-person descriptions of human experience and behavior, and two behaviorists have just made love, and one says to the other, "That was great for you. How was it for me?" And then there's Kant's, Jake was describing Kant's great, going to use that in one of your monologues now. Kant was saying what really is moral, and Nietzsche's response to Kant was Kant has shown us that he's basically the kind of person who likes to obey. That was his argument in a nutshell.
Nietzsche would have been really great at Twitter.
Yeah, that's right. He would have been. I didn't think of that. Would have driven him nuts, though. The critiques, the other responses, and then the naturalistic fallacy. That's such a strange term, and he describes it as it's a misnamed fallacy because I mean. The naturalistic fallacy is that you're projecting onto nature what are really human categories, and those don't belong in the world per se. And Taylor would basically regard that as the naturalistic fallacy, to believe that. So we could call it the naturalistic fallacy. And I wanted to give an example of how even a strongly held hypergood is always has to be judged in a context of multiple goods, and it doesn't always have the prior claim. So, for example, even the Supreme Court had one famous decision where it's basically trying to uphold freedom of speech. It's a very big part of American political and moral ideals. But are there limits? And was it Oliver Wendell Holmes or one of the Supreme Court, Brandeis, I can't remember who it was, said, you're not free to yell fire in a crowded theater. So there you can see that a higher good, namely a survival for, and really like respect for the lives of others, trumps your need, outweighs your need for, or your right, your claim to freedom of self-expression. I was thinking of of how we go through hypergood transitions in our lives, because there's multiple hypergoods that are circulating in our each of our psychic, worlds, our moral worlds, and one you could, I think, when you see two people who have just given birth to a baby, and so the two previously independent adults are now a mother and a father, and very often, not always, but very often, this can bring about a supersession of hypergoods where you suddenly, it suddenly becomes, while before what was most important was expressive individualism, let's say, suddenly gets outweighed by what you see now as a higher value, which is being a loving, responsible, competent mother or father. So that's one that, we can all relate to. There's probably age-appropriate hypergoods, just as I think there are culturally appropriate hypergoods. I'll just mention some of the hypergoods that we might consider as central ones for the modern. I'd written these in the margin of another book, but so modern hypergoods, which we can recognize as in the moral universe of the modern period: rational mastery of the self, which includes in the modern mastery of one's passions, of one's body, and of nature. It gets in our own nature, but also particularly coming out of the Cartesian mentality, though Descartes didn't originate it, the rational control of it through objectifying and understanding nature. Freedom, autonomy, self-determination. That's another overlapping set of goods that would be hypergoods for the modern. Universal and equal respect, justice. Another one would be practical benevolence, altruism, relief of suffering. For some people, those would outweigh one's own freedom, for example. Another would be expressive individualism. Certain artists who so committed to their art that they will not be a very good father or mother, or some other values that many of us would consider to be very important, and yet they create like great works of art. Wagner, for example, Picasso. I mean, God, the list actually after the Me Too movement is just endless. And then a rich conception of family life, of being a householder, and affirmation of ordinary life in general. All those are part of the universe of the moral world, and hypergoods in our that are of crucial importance for our identity, fulfillment, etc. And then, by contrast, just so you can see how it looks different in another era. Oh, I see what's happening. Sorry that I didn't have this typed out, but I kind of ran out of time. So in the primal hypergoods would be things like attunement and full embeddedness in the tribal community, and that community includes not just the immediate human beings. It includes the ancestors, the ancestral spirits. It includes the land, the animals, the plants, a sense of belonging to the whole. Much more important than this modern focus on the individuated, self-expressive, free self. This is belonging to the whole, but it's a very local whole. It's a smaller universe than in certain respects. The archaic hypergoods of honor, warrior prowess, dominance of public space, great deeds, and so forth, or the axial hypergoods of love of God, love of the good, capital G, purity. That's a very big axial hypergood that refers sometimes to the spirit, sometimes to the body, to the mind, to sexual relations. It takes all sorts of forms. Obedience to the transcendent. It's moved from obedience to the pharaoh and the cosmic state in the archaic period to, in the axial period, it's obedient to the transcendent one God, or the highest good. And you could say, I haven't drawn it, but you could say in our postmodern context, there's much more of a sense of a hypergood of ecological justice, for example. Ecological awareness, justice, sustainability, also very much an expansion or radicalization of the modern hypergood of equal respect, to really to break out of the patriarchal and racial and Eurocentric and other constraints that the modern, there's always what Vogelin called mortgages to the past in every worldview. And the modern has certain archaic and axial mortgages to the past that it carried, and patriarchy was one of them. The superiority of the human over the rest of nature is straight out of God over the world, and the Pharaoh over all the other sectors of society. Only with us, it's like this invisible pyramid of we're at the top, and then there's other animals who sometimes we don't even bother saying other animals. We just say, well, there's the animals. We humans are so different, so superior. And that's still, it's still very living. But that deep ecological moral sense that's been emerging, particularly in the last 50 years, among larger and larger numbers of people, that's a hypergood. And it's taking over from the anthropocentric sense of superiority that is a modern hypergood. So we can see that we're all involved in a supersession of hypergoods that is very significant. I'll just finish. Okay, if I just say one more thing and then open up to questions, or I could say this for another time. This is following up the question of whether moral space and moral frameworks are ontologically basic. Why don't I save it for another time, because I want to give more time to discussion, and I can do that anytime.
Something to look forward to next week.
Yeah. So let's open up to comments and questions, and for Jake or myself, or just to share with all of us. Joseph, you've got your hand up first. You're like, you've got the Sean Kelly Award. Sean would always be first.
Well, I think one thing that came into my mind is this book is about 40 years old.
Yeah.
And since for the past 20, 30 years, we have had lots of new theoretical systems, right? One of them is, for example, the Fricker and idea about the collective ethics, right? The short of that argument is that there is also collective ethics in addition to our individual ethics. And for example, I can give an example rather than explaining the idea is, if you have seen the movie Seven Samurai by Kurosawa, okay? So each samurai has an individual ethical framework, and also there is this collective ethical framework. And Kurosawa does a very interesting job of flip-flopping, of some of these samurais flip-flopping between the individual framework to collective framework, okay? So, and I think as we go ahead, this collective ethics basically kind of overcomes the individual.
Can you give an example of what you mean, like an example of collective ethics versus an example of individual?
Yeah, for example, the samurai wants to have a glorious life, go and fight something that can make lots of money, but at the same time, they have this collective goal of protecting the village that doesn't give him any money or anything, basically. But they just go ahead and do that. Now, Fricker goes even beyond that, and he says non-agents.
Who goes beyond it?
Fricker.
Okay.
Miranda Fricker. She's an Oxford philosopher. So anyway, she says that non-agents have collective ethics, like institutions have ethics. And when we join those institutions, we basically follow those ethics, and somehow these two conflicts. And when it conflicts, it creates all kinds of issues. So anyway, they have lots of following, basically, this collective epistemology and collective ethics. So the whole idea is that it's not just the self in today's environment. As we go further and further, this self becomes more and more isolated, and collective ethics and collective epistemology takes over.
Well, All right, so let's see. I guess I was. I'll say something and then I'll ask Jake, because I was kind of hearing it in two different ways. On the one hand, one could say, I thought you might be making a sharp distinction between like that there's the individual ethical good of, like, say, self-success of the samurai, and then there is their collective ethic. And are you saying that the collective ethic in our day, maybe you could give an example of it, is overcoming individual ethics?
More and more. Yeah. For example, the corporations. When you join the corporations in today's environment, the Silicon Valley corporations, you basically adopt that, and we can see that in the history of anything unethical that happens in the board of corporations. I mean, people just have. When they join that corporations, they just go ahead and adopt.
No, I hear what you're saying. So, in that case, there's very strong criticisms within the society of the corporate man, the man in the gray suit. It started, in the 1950s. Was very strong, kind of awareness of that problem. And of course, the counterculture, the Beats, the hippies were all attempting to say, we're not going there. And yet, in some ways, you could say the American tendency towards radical individualism is so extreme that it outweighs the collective ethic of serving the community, serving the whole, and that the corporation is an example of that in its positing itself as the sovereign good, and not worrying about the community that it's decimating ecologically or in terms of economically or whatever, but just profit that can go to the top of the corporate ladder, individuals who are in management, CEOs, or to the stockholders. And so, in that sense, a kind of a radical individualism is, in many ways, one of the besetting sins of the American mode of life. But there's also, so what you were describing is a shadow form, a collective ethic that, namely of the corporation, that is not, I think, in your mind, and probably all of ours, as noble, as morally defensible as the individual ethic of,
It could be. Actually, the studies that have done and the philosophical books are mostly saying that collectives have a better understanding of epistemic truth and moral values. In most cases, those corporations were a little bit maybe out of.
Well, I think of Jung's great, confrontation. I mean, he's living in the middle of the 20th century, or through the first half of the 20th century, and just going, the whole focus on our moral evolution has to be through the individual breaking out of collectivist mentality, because he's just witnessed what happened in Germany, what happened in Russia, what's happening, the mass movements of fascism and communism were so, they were both so enormous historical realities for the 20th century and so catastrophic that, so the individual is kind of he felt that's where the nerve of moral evolution rests. Please, Jake, what thoughts have you?
One way to think about it is, Taylor doesn't use that language because it's the language you're using in particular is more recent. Can you hand me a marker? Or here, I'll take this one. But I think you could fit those Fricker-style collective ethics language into Taylor's account without too much of a problem. Rick's right to think about those kind of descriptions as anticipated by mid-20th century discussions. So, like Marcuse or Hannah Arendt, or the more sort of popular countercultural just rejections of the man or Davos man or corporate man or whatever. Right? It was all that sense that there's like an impersonalized mass society that overcomes and subordinates individual interests to it.
Jimi Hendrix saying, I see you, white-collar conservative, walking down the street.
Yeah.
You can't dress like me. I wave my freak flag high.
Yeah.
That was the
Exactly.
paradigm.
But so think about it this way: hypergoods, or you could think about it this way: hypergoods are not. This is not a. To call something a hypergood isn't to make the substantive claim that the hypergood is actually the good. It's a structural description of the hypergood's relationship to other higher order goods or higher ordered goods, and then other goods, right? So the hypergood transcends these higher order goods and the good. And the reason why it's so interesting is because it empowers, right? To be in contact or to perceive a hypergood is to have a tremendous sense of empowerment that goes along with that.
That's what will be a big theme next chapter.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be really emancipatory, or that can be really dangerous, right? We're in a time of resurgent populism now. One of the reasons for talking about all this stuff is because I think mass phenomena and populist phenomena are appearing again in a way that a lot of people in the 1990s, I think, far too quickly thought we were done with, right? And populist or collectivist or collective versions of the good always have or can more easily have a relation of a hypergood to your other goods than purely individually held things, right? Because they can be empowered by the entire community. You're subordinate to the entire community, so they present themselves as a kind of hypergood. And that can empower tremendous work on behalf of something. Right? Think about joining a movement think about like joining the school strikes along
Occupy
with
movement.
Greta Thunberg or something.
Oh, yeah.
That sense of like being part of a good that's now that I perceive. I didn't perceive it when I was just on my own, but as I join, I perceive it more fully, and as I perceive it, I'm more empowered to act. But it can also be, you can think of really destructive versions, right? That's really easy, and lots of them are on hand now for us to think about. So the collective good is neither immediately morally superior. It doesn't, whether it's collective or individual, doesn't immediately supersede all these previous forms. They come along with us. Or these previous iterations of selfhood are carried along with us. What Rick was calling, following Vogelin, the mortgages to the past. And I think the error we get into is to thinking that we could decide upon the superiority or the inferiority of a given vision of the good merely by looking at these structural contents. And that's what Taylor's trying to vastly resist, is to say, no, you have to pay attention to the inner phenomenology. You could have a collective, one appeal of describing goods collectively is that you can then provide a kind of sociological description of them. So you can reduce the good to a function of the socius, the society, as opposed to the good being an articulation of inner space, right? If it's a description of the way, if you can make it correspond to sociology, that's another way of doing, this arrow inward. It's just instead of taking physics as your description of outer reality, you're taking sociology as your description of outer reality. Taylor himself is often identified as a communitarian, which is, communitarians tend to think that community is way more important for philosophical consideration than a lot of 20th century philosophers, political philosophers and political theorists have wanted to. But he doesn't want to say that community trumps individuality. I think he's, or terrible word, I think he wants to say community.
So much for bridge.
I know, it's just really hard. It's really hard not to. Anyway, he wants to say that community and individuality need to be held in a kind of polar comportment to one another.
Like he and Robert Bellah are strongly within the Western and particularly American, North American frame of reference, because it's so hyper-individualistic.
Yeah.
They're trying to bring in a communitarian corrective to that. But as Bellah said, who is also a Japan expert, if I were writing Habits of the Heart for Japan rather than for the United States, I would have written a paean to individualism. So it just depends on the context.
Yeah. Okay. Did I see other hands?
At the beginning of the course, you talked about what Taylor could offer PCC and what we could offer him. And I was thinking at this whole question of best accounts, and I was thinking of like archetypal cosmology. I mean, he doesn't go as radical as we do in terms of the examples he uses. So I'm just wondering, because for me, that's a larger account. That's these sort of, or the Jung's collective unconscious, or like these are a larger account, a richer, a thicker description. So I just wanted to hear what you have to say about like what we have to offer. Very, very true. And I think what my thoughts were about in terms of how the course would unfold is, as a whole, this course is for Taylor to teach us things that we, I think, could really use, and it actually helps us with our projects, whether it's the Jungian view or archetypal cosmology or different views of the evolution of consciousness, or how we think about deep ecology, for example. In all these ways, Taylor provides us really valuable conceptual tools. And so I'm seeing that as being the major vector of the course. But in a way, like when I started putting in my spiral mandala here, I didn't draw it all out, but I mean, I'm already kind of fitting it into the PCC discourse that we've been developing for 25 years here, and that will just naturally happen. Jung gives us Taylor gives us insights into Jung in the later parts of this book. He only mentions Jung very briefly, but as part of modernism. But it's a good insight, and even though it doesn't capture all of Jung. But I see Jung and Taylor, just by the way, as having complementary projects. Taylor basically is affirming the I would call it let's see. Taylor's like opening up the depths of the human subject to recognize the objectivity of our moral world, and how underlying and informing that world, which is ontologically robust, are underlying and constituting that world are goods and hypergoods and moral sources. Jung opened up the psyche and revealed the objectivity of the psyche and of psychic reality, and saw that reality as being informed by and constituted by powerful archetypal principles. And these, you could say,
Jung was particularly reclaiming archetypally the lunar side of human experience and deepening our grasp of it, and Taylor is doing that for the solar self, for the I won't go into solar and lunar right now, but he's doing it, and we have tended to, I feel that in PCC, our tendency has been to regard this Cartesian modern subject as basically a rationalist payoff calculator, and objectifying the world, eliminating the anima mundi, and so forth. And Taylor is giving us a much richer account of what that subject is, of what the modern subject is, and that's really that's so valuable. We haven't spoken a lot in PCC about goods. We just live according to them, and they shape our lives and they shape our thinking, but we haven't been consciously reflective. We've gotten really consciously reflective about what archetypal powers are shaping our day-to-day life, or what our transits are, or we're very committed to ecological, social justice, all sorts, but we haven't reflected on how those goods and hypergoods have kind of emerged and constellated in our lives, and in that sense, Taylor's giving us, I think, just a great gift.
I think when I think about the one area, in addition to the ones you mentioned, that PCC-ish approaches could push or complement or develop what Taylor's doing, the area I think of a lot would be putting all of these progressions of selfhood into a broader evolutionary history, and what kind of a best account metaphysically, let's say, does that require us to give, right? What am I committed, if I'm committed to using this language of hypergoods and moral frameworks and things like that as the best account of my inhabitation of the world and of moral space, what then, when I try to understand my relationship to 13.7 billion years of cosmic history or whatever, is the best account I have to give of not just things in here, but also things out there? And it's going to involve much more continuity than we start with in this picture. It's not to say this picture is wrong, but to say that what's present in the world, what I have to say is present in the world even before humans got here, there has to be something that's not merely reducible to the third person objective picture that is the deliverances of post-17th century, that is the deliverance of post-17th century science, right?
Subjectivity goes all the way down.
Or proto-subjectivity or something, but
yeah.
something, it's a much richer value-laden world
Yeah.
than our current narratives tend to say.
And the value of following Taylor through what he's doing here is that I feel we're already embedded in that kind of re-enchanted evolutionary cosmology, as a result of which we can be blind to certain things that he can see, and that he can help us see, which actually helps our project, even as we may be able to help his, even though we may not deliver it to him in person, but it will go into the discourse of life. I think it's an exciting project. That's why we've wanted to do this for so many years, because I mean, what you've been through just this past week, I think, is the hardest reading and thinking through things that you'll have to do. I mean, not that there's a lot of riches to come, but they'll come easier.
This is the most abstract. I think this is the most abstract.
Yeah, there are very few examples that he's giving, and he's in arguments with other philosophers. you can just imagine the world that he's been living in Oxford and McGill and Harvard and all the places that he's taught, and you know, the vocabulary that is second nature to him is not second nature to the general reader. So, yeah. Anybody else have something they'd like to? Oh, yeah.
I was wondering with regards to this evolutionary component that he was talking about with the goods, and you showing it in your images as well. So I was wondering, this is all for the Western mind, and we like, for example, like the separation of church and state. There's still countries that never had that separation, and I'm wondering, can those cultures still be considered to like evolve into a modern that we're talking about if they didn't go through the previous steps in the same way? Or is it like if we do the work in one culture, we're doing the work for all of it?
Yeah, I'll let Jake go first, and then I'll add. No, I mean I'm happy to, but I thought you were kind of moving forward.
Yeah, no,
I'm eager to answer. But
I think Taylor's been really involved with groups thinking about the nature of the modern, and in particular, people like Talal Asad and Saba Mahmoud, who were thinking about various iterations of precisely the kind of differentiations you were describing. And a lot of folks in that world of discourse will talk not about modernity in the singular, and Taylor tends not to talk that way now either, but rather of modernities. There are multiple ways in which modernity can be realized, and there are multiple competing modernities out there right now. So it would be, this is a Eurocentric narrative that Taylor is telling, and that's important because it's one really large narrative that's shaping a huge amount of the world. But there are other ways in which modernity has been realized, including contact and colonialism and all this sort of other things, so that it would be wrong to say that places where there's not a let me take a totally uncontroversial example. The kind of separation of church and state that we have in America is not the same as the kind of separation of church and state that they have in France, right? Laïcité means something very different in France than it does here in America. And it's also very different from the kind of separation of church and state that you have, say, in England, where
which Taylor actually discusses in a future chapter of this book. Yeah.
And so there's so that kind of you can't sort of reify one version of that and say that's what the modern is. And I think Taylor would want to be very careful not to do that. And a lot of his work since Sources of the Self, he was aware of it at the time, but he had a big enough project as it was, I guess. But a lot of his work since Sources of the Self is paying attention to those
multiculturalism is a big
iterations.
Focus of his work in the last 20 years.
Yeah. So it's not the case that just one heroic community does the work for all the other communities of the world. It's that there are different ways in which trajectories of development or trajectories of there are different ways in which trajectories towards higher goods or hypergoods emerge, and they may not. The question then becomes like, to what extent are they reconcilable? They're not always identically reconcilable or easily reconcilable, and that's where that difficult work of deliberation comes in, hopefully, as opposed to the less difficult but far worse work of polemic or suppression.
I'd say Taylor in this book is writing for other members of what he elsewhere calls like the North Atlantic civilization. That's why he'll use words like we and us in a way that presupposes that particular community of readers. But even though he is describing a Eurocentric story, it's not in a form that is attempting to kind of imperialistically impose that on the world as the story. It's Eurocentric in the same way that a biography of Virginia Woolf is Virginia Woolf centric, and is trying to understand her from within her world and her evolution of moral and emotional, etc. So I think the value for us is everybody in this room has been profoundly shaped by that evolution in different ways, with different mix. We've got a number of multicultural people here and online in the online course, and that brings in a whole complexity of perspective and a parallax view that's very valuable. But the advantage of understanding what this is about, and it's the same thing that Passion of the Western Mind was seeking to do, was to try to understand what shaped the evolving sensibility and worldview that has, more than any other cultural worldview, shaped the world and the global crisis that we're all in today. Because that's one of the great paradoxes of everything that we're doing here in understanding this Western trajectory, is that on the one hand, here's these evolution of hypergoods, and there's a lot of nobility either in the story or aspired to in the narrative. And yet, at the same time, we somehow, this civilization, this species, and civilization and era, each of which is undeniably brilliant and dynamic, have somehow constellated a global catastrophe unprecedented in any human history, and really unprecedented in the last 66 million years. So we need to understand that. Like, how did this quest that involves so much nobility, as well as all the shadow side of what it is to be human and what it was to be European or European North Americans, white people, males, etc. How can we understand how even the good was playing a role in what we are now facing? And those paradoxes are, I think, essential to our project here.
Please.
Yeah, I'm not sure where this fits, and I know we're running out of time, but anticipating Martha Nussbaum's article next week, which I looked at, we haven't really talked about what can be implicit in naming a good, which is the implicit assumption about a non-good or ungood or a rejected other upon which the good pivots.
Almost kind of like Aristotelian, what he was saying about the affirmation of other goods. So that when you get to another good, maybe that other good ain't so good.
Well, that was one thing mentioned in here, but it's also, thinking about the good that created, the Negro, the white good that created the Negro, or the way we composite an upper,
Right.
and in doing that implicitly create a lower.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, which is one of the reasons why, as Taylor points out, hypergoods have been negated in the effort towards equal respect, and also, like, how can we judge another culture? We're just imposing our imperialist mentality once again, and yet he reminds us, well, that actually comes out of our own development, to be questioning our imperialist shadow, and that still doesn't stop us from having very profound moral intuitions that wife burning and slavery are not just okay for another culture, but not for us. They're not good, period. And so that's where the hypergood comes in, which gives us, we need to consider how much that gives us a leverage to be able to contemplate. These are real values that we can look out at and assess ourselves, our past, and other cultures from a position that it's always in dialogue, it always can be corrected, but it is at least it's not just completely bound in a culture's relativity or our own individual relativity. There's something that's transcending that, and we all live according to that transcendent quality.
So next week, we will be adding another voice to the discussion. You can download the readings on Canvas. So we'll be reading chapter 4 of Taylor on moral sources, and I can't remember whether it's Nussbaum or Melissa Lane on Taylor and feminism. But we'll begin to add some other voices, which we'll continue to do throughout the term. So we'll keep that conversation going. The one thing I wanted to add is, I think you haven't gotten to the historical narrative yet, so you may not know this, but I want to tell you at least the way I read it ahead of time is Taylor's historical narrative is not a celebration or a justification of any particular vision of the good. I think Taylor's historical narrative is intended to draw our critical attention to the way hypergoods have functioned for us. His point is not hypergoods, yeah! His point is these can be tremendously powerful and emancipatory and tremendously dangerous, and you're not going to get rid of them by denying them. So we need to bring critical reflection to realize precisely how they function, to establish dominance hierarchies or exclusionary hierarchies or something like that. Bringing attention to that helps us be more critically self-aware and socially and morally and politically self-aware of the ways in which we're functioning. When we aren't capable of articulating it, when we buy into some sort of a priori form of naturalism that mutes us and robs us of the vocabulary that alone makes our actions intelligible, then we have a much harder time realizing the ways in which we're not responding properly to the good, or we're using the good in ways that are deeply unjust and exclusionary.
Or that we're not even sufficiently aware that there are multiple goods at play, because we haven't differentiated them, and so we're not understanding the conflicts as well as we might. But as you'll see in next chapter, knowing the moral sources is empowering, as Jake said. To get in touch with those moral sources more directly is to move us out of a cramped world.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also a spiritual and moral value in becoming more aware.
Plus, you have it's less pages to read for next week than for this week, so huzzah!
Yeah.
And thank you.
Thanks, Jake.